began its life as a sermon, which I preached to my own congregation as part of a series on ethics and ethical issues that we come across today. I mention this because you might find that this talk is a bit more sermonic and a bit less lecture-like than you might often hear here, I'm not sure. But I also mention it because I stand here without any pretensions of being an expert on euthanasia. I'm really simply a theologically trained preacher who spent some time researching, exegeting, praying and putting together a sermon on this topic. And I bring what I've learned to you today to share and for us to discuss together. But interestingly, when I did this, I discovered two things. One, that this is actually an issue I feel quite passionately about once I began to look into it. And secondly, it's an issue that really personally challenges me to the core. So I'm not sure where you stand or how you've thought through this, but this is where I'm coming from tonight. I'm going to attempt a daring stunt tonight, but it's probably one that you're quite used to here at Reasonable Faith. I'm going to walk, I hope, a very narrow path with a steep cliff on either side. On one side is truth, on the other side is compassion. Now, I don't want to fall down the truth side by I don't want to soften or compromise the truth with too much compassion. But at the same time, I don't want to be so firm in my truth that I don't realise the consequences of what I'm proposing. So that's my task tonight, to stay on this very narrow path, and I'm inviting you to walk with me and even to nudge me a bit either way if you think I'm about to topple over. I have very little personal experience in the issue of euthanasia. The closest I've ever come is I had 1 week where I visited my grandmother in hospital. My parents were in the other end of the country and she had suffered a brain hemorrhage and it was decided that she wouldn't be resuscitated, and I spent quite a lot of time in that week just being with her in the last days of her life. But I've never had to watch somebody that I loved die of a terminal illness. I'm sure, in fact I know that some of you have, and so in a way you're ahead of me. And I feel a little tentative about making pronouncements, but once again, knowing that you'll have a chance to share as well gives me comfort there. Also, I'm attempting not so much to just tell you what I think, but really to point the way that I believe the biblical witness tells us, and thinking in a God-like way will lead us. So let's proceed in truth and love and humility, and confident that the Spirit is with us. Let's just start out by making sure that we all mean the same thing. The term euthanasia these days, it's gone through a bit of evolution, but it's come to mean basically the taking of a person's life for compassionate reasons. But there's also a few other sort of further breakdowns. One is people talk about passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. So passive euthanasia is where somebody would not be surviving except for human intervention, and that human intervention is removed. Now, many, and I as well, I would not actually classify that as euthanasia, and I'll explain a little bit more why later on. The other side of it is active euthanasia, which talks about the deliberate intervention, deliberate action to end life. And that's mainly what I will be addressing tonight, and what I mean when I say the word euthanasia. Now there's a bit of further sort of branching, because there's also people talk about voluntary euthanasia and involuntary euthanasia. Voluntary being where a person is willing and able to make that decision for themselves to end their life, and involuntary euthanasia being where somebody either doesn't or more often can't give that consent, and so somebody else makes that decision. So is that all clear? Good. Well, I want to begin tonight by just giving a bit of looking at what the Bible has to say about euthanasia. Now, there's no wonderful verse which sums it all up. In fact, there's nothing really specific and pointed about what we would consider euthanasia today in the Bible. So where do we start? I'd like you to picture a stool. A stool is a seat with legs. Without legs, it's just a round piece of wood, a whole lot less useful. We need strong and stable legs to support our seat, because the real test of a stool is not how nice it looks, but whether it holds you up when you sit down. And that's the same with an ethical position. So we need to examine the legs of our argument really well and carefully to see if they'll bear the weight of our conclusions. Now, the stool leg that's most often relied on by those who are against euthanasia is commonly known as sanctity of life. You heard that expression? Now, the Bible doesn't use the phrase sanctity of life. It's a bit of a catch-all summing up of a whole sort of approach. There's no verse that says everything we want it to say. But there's plenty that we can draw a picture from. Let me give you just a little. God begins life. God is the life giver. In Genesis 2:7, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So God is the source, the originator of life. Secondly, we note God hates killing. Just 2 chapters later, after God breathes life, the first murder occurs. And God says to Cain, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The command, "do not kill," is one of our big 10. And it also appears in other different guises through the Old Testament and the law books. And then we have this, Genesis 9:6. "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." And this is a very interesting verse. Firstly, God is saying whoever kills a person will be accountable for it. Secondly, in saying that a life will pay for a life, God is saying all life is of equal value. And thirdly, God gives us the reason why life is sacred. Because humankind is made in the image of God, and God is sacred. It's not quite so straightforward as it, is it? I'm sure it won't have escaped you that Genesis 9:6 actually orders life to be taken, to pay for the one who was killed. And you wouldn't have to read a lot further in the Old Testament to see there's rather a lot of killing. Some of it seems to be sanctioned by God as judgment. And just as all human societies have always had a moral law against killing, almost all have also had exceptions. So, there is such a thing as a one-legged stool. I'm not sure this is the leg that we're looking for. Because I'm not sure this holds the weight that we want it to. Sanctity of life, derived from creation in God's image, very right, true, important, but not something which cannot be violated at any cost. Just think about soldiers defending a country. Think about a mother whose life is hanging on the edge due to her unborn baby. Because society has exceptions to the sanctity of life, it's difficult without more to argue that euthanasia should not be one of those. But it's still an important element, so let's just hang on to it. I think the biblical argument can be built on one leg. It's a leg that has no exceptions and which cannot be violated at all. It's the sovereignty of God. God's sovereignty, basically the idea that God is in control and we are not. He is God and we are not. And really, when we think about it, the sovereignty of God is a fundamental, dominant theme which comes all through our biblical story. Mainly because humankind has a great tendency to keep challenging that, despite the evidence, to just keep testing it one more time. Now, it's not at all difficult to find passages which talk about God's godness. There's actually 303 references to God just as being sovereign, using those words. But let's choose some that look specifically at God's sovereignty over life and death. Isaiah 46, 9-10. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. Psalm 104, 27-30. All creatures look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to dust. When you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Psalm 39, 4-5. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handful. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure. Job 14:5. A person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed. And you probably know this one. Proverbs 16:9. In their hearts, humans plan their courses, but the Lord establishes their steps. And a final one, Jeremiah 10:23. Lord, I know that people's lives are not their own. It is not for them to direct their steps. Now, one argument that we often hear in favour of euthanasia is this idea that a person has the right to decide their time of death and whether to undergo what is before them. And we can see from these verses that for the Christian, this is completely out of whack with the idea of God's sovereignty. Belief in Jesus, in the Trinitarian God, means submitting to that God's will. And that includes the timing and the manner of our death and life that we live till then, and the timing and manner of death of anyone else. Let me say here, this is where I feel that passive euthanasia is not euthanasia, because I don't feel that it actually conflicts with the sovereignty of God. If a person is being kept alive by artificial means and those means are taken away, I don't see that as being an intervention in God's will. It's possibly more of an acceptance of God's will. And it upholds God's sovereignty in a way that an intentional act can't. So I think this leg, sovereignty of God, is strong enough to support our story. But for those of you who like engineering, we're going to get the sanctity of life and we'll put it around the bottom, like a supporting buttress. So we've got one of those kind of bar stools with a seat and a big solid leg and a buttress around the bottom. Now, while you're considering whether you want to sit on my stool, you have a look around the room and you notice some other stools. Perhaps looking for one with more legs, and you spot one. Let's call this the stool in favour of euthanasia. Now this stool looks really nice. It's got more legs, they're nicely polished and turned, they look great. But it's still the sit-down test that really counts, isn't it? When we look at worldly arguments, we need to be really careful, because whether we realise it or not, we're all influenced by the culture around us. It's there, we can look at it, but it's also in us, and it's also part of us. And so sometimes it can be difficult to identify where our beliefs are coming from. And even more, I think we need to be really careful about how beliefs are framed and worded, because sometimes the very words that are used can kind of trick us into thinking that something else has been said. And it makes our task even harder to get to the bottom of it. So we're going to have a close look now at a few of the legs of this stool, a few arguments that are often put forward in favour of euthanasia, and see if we can trace them back to their source. The first one of these legs I'd like to look at is the right to die. The modern history of euthanasia began when a book was published in Germany in 1895 called The Right to Die. Now, this concept of death as a right has been around for more than a century, but it's kind of gained strength over that time as generally the idea of human rights has grown. A man called Bob Dent was the first person to die voluntary euthanasia, while the Northern Territory law, which allowed it, was briefly enforced. And he said this: "If you disagree with voluntary euthanasia, then don't use it. But don't deny me the right to use it." Now we need to examine this statement really carefully. What can we possibly mean by a right to die? And is it really a defendable right? A right is more than simply being allowed to do something. We have a lot of things in our society that we are allowed to do, but they're not enshrined as rights. A right is something that is so important to society that it is considered imperative to defend the freedom to exercise it. So you might say in this light, a right to die seems just a little bit weird, because after all, we all get to do it, don't we? You might also say just about every other right you can think of is based around protection of life, or protection of the quality of life. And so this puts the right to extinguish life in a bit of a different category. And there are many other tricky questions like, so who actually has this right? Everybody who wants it? Only people with terminal disease? Only those with a certain level of pain? But what about this? Against whom is the right asserted? Everyone else? Nature? God? Blind injustice? Let me just say, a right to die in this context differs from suicide. Suicide is one of those things that is allowed, but is not a right. Suicide is no longer an offence, but it's not a right. And really, as a society, we do what we can to prevent it, don't we? So really, the right to die must be the right to be killed by someone else and the right to choose when. And here lies the real irony of this, because what is supposedly a fundamental right, a fundamental freedom to one individual, places an enormous obligation on somebody else to kill. And this to me seems not only to be logically wrong, but morally wrong. I don't think Bob Dent is right. He can't have his freedom without seriously impinging on somebody else's. The idea that that right is his alone and doesn't affect other people's choices is simply not true. We need to step back a little and we need to recognise that we are part of a rights culture. And that rights culture has its origin in individual autonomy, and it often doesn't look beyond the person who's claiming the right. I'm not saying there are not fundamental rights which do need protection. But in this case, at the very least, we need to ask, what does God think of this? And how sturdy is this leg of the stool? Well, let's look at another leg. This one's difficult. It's called pain and suffering. I think at the bottom of the call for legislation about euthanasia, the deepest part of it is the human struggle with the experience of pain and suffering. Our culture has the idea that pain is unnatural, is unexpected, is not to be endured. Further, that life dominated by pain and suffering is meaningless and of little worth. Euthanasia is then framed as the release or escape from that pain and suffering. And then to deny release or escape is seen as cruel and lacking compassion. Now, I think the West probably does this worst of all. We tend to feel that our fear and avoidance of pain and suffering is exaggerated beyond any other culture. I think in the poorer world, at least, suffering is expected. But it's a deeper problem than just the West. It's a human problem. I see it in my own life. In all kinds of trivial ways. I still have this expectation that sickness and pain are evil, unfair interruptions of my life. I expect my life to flow without hitch from success to success. And when pain and suffering intervene, it's just not fair, it's unacceptable. When it doesn't happen, I'm downcast, I'm disappointed, I'm even fearful. And I'm a believer, and I know God's attitude about these things. And you know God's attitude about these things? It's a world away. In fact, if you read the biblical story, you might get the impression that God sees more meaning in suffering than he does in happiness. Certainly he knows it's more useful for us than comfort to be growing like Jesus. But he doesn't just tell us to suffer, does he? He is a suffering God. By his own choice, he knows more about pain and suffering and heartache than we ever will. He encourages us to share in his sufferings that we might share in his glory. Paul, his apostle, says, our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. And Jesus himself says, take up your cross daily, follow me. And once again, I feel compelled to say, I feel my lack of experience. I know that I'm speaking about situations and about pain that I know nothing about. But we do need to be careful about exaggerated portrayals. When I was researching this, it was good to read the words of Brian Pollard, who is an anaesthetist spending many, many years in palliative care. And he said this: it is a shameful parody to portray the modern dilemma about decisions regarding death as a grim choice between intolerable suffering and its only real alternative of being killed. Now, Pollard has cared for thousands of terminally ill patients, and he believes that the number for which pain is unbearable and unmanageable is actually quite small. And that those who do find pain like that are probably in situations where their caring is inadequate. In fact, he grows quite angry and he says, this whole subject of palliative care receives so much less attention than euthanasia. If the resources and the time and the care could be put into how we care for people who are dying, rather than whether we should do it. So, another leg of the stool. It's perhaps not everything it seems. Here's the third one. A phrase used frequently by advocates of euthanasia: dying with dignity. Sounds a bit like a motherhood statement. I mean, who wouldn't want to die with dignity? It's even alliterated. But what's really being said here? We need to question that someone who's in pain and dependent on others can't have any dignity? It's hard actually to pin down in the debate what dignity is supposed to mean, but it seems to be something like this. Dignity means being quiet, clean, seemly, and in control of oneself. And one writer said, well, if this is the case, then no human's ever been born in dignity, and most fail to live consistently in it for the rest of their lives. But is this what dignity truly means? Is this how God would see it? We can't find a verse that says it all, but I firmly believe that in God's eyes, human dignity is about the best of being human. It's about facing life with faith and courage, humility, knowing your true worth, understanding and accepting that we are not and never can be in control. That is dignity. And so we see a flip. In fact, the person willing to face the death they are given, rather than choosing to opt out, they are the person with dignity. Dignity has very little to do with the nature of our death and the time we choose it, and everything to do with how we face it. And I'm sure you've seen this in other people's lives. Can you think of people you've known and loved who've demonstrated this kind of dignity? So how's the stool looking? Want to sit down? There's another big question though. And you probably already thought of it. And it goes like this: well, okay, Miranda, Christians should refuse euthanasia. I get that. But can we really impose this on everybody else? On the rest of society? Humanity? Is it right to impose our values and beliefs on everyone else? Doesn't Bob Dent have some kind of a point? I think there are some ethical issues that is not appropriate for Christians to dictate how other people should live. But this is not one of them. There are two reasons for this. They're both biggies. The first, this is not an ethical issue about lifestyle, about how we live. This is an ethical issue about life and death. And it's about the life of some people in the hands of other people. And I don't think Christians or humans in general should stand back when something like this is before us. But the second big reason is this: human beings are sinful and cannot be trusted. You, me, we can't. Human beings are incapable of pure, completely unselfish motives. And we are endlessly capable of deceiving ourselves about that. There is great danger in putting the power of life and death into human hands, especially in relation to others. In my former life as a solicitor, I had a lot of clients who were looking to bring either a challenge to a will or an inheritance claim against their family's estate. So I worked in that area of wills and estates. Not a single client ever looked me in the eye and said, "This is really about the money." They're always full of so many other reasons why they were deserving and their brothers or sisters were not, or their father had been unfair to them, or all of these other issues. It wasn't about the money. And yet, a colleague who I admire very greatly said this to me: "You will never meet an inheritance lawyer who will support euthanasia. Ever." But perhaps I had a bad sample. Let's take another example. It's a really good example, and that's abortion. Let's have a look at what happened when abortion became legalised. Now, all the states of Australia are similar. They all have the same kind of wording in their legislation. And it focuses around the assessment of risk to the mother in proceeding with the pregnancy. Now, when this was first legislated, it was sold to people and supported by the public out of compassion for women. Compassion for those at risk, compassion for those who become pregnant in traumatic and horrible circumstances. And so people felt, well, okay, there is perhaps a small place for abortion. But as the years went on, and this happened in every state of Australia, the interpretation of this risk, the assessment of risk, became broader and broader and broader. And the current situation, where in fact a full-term pregnancy will always be riskier than not going ahead, means that anyone may choose abortion without justifiable reason. But perhaps it's different for euthanasia. Well, we have an example in this as well. Euthanasia has been practiced in the Netherlands since the early 1970s. It's first with the courts, who set down all kinds of conditions about how it should take place, and then with legislation in 2002. Now, in the early 2000s, the Dutch government's own research commission was set up to have a look at how euthanasia was being implemented. And they uncovered some amazing things. They found that from early on, doctors were not following the conditions, particularly the ones about consent. In the year of the Commission's research, 1990, there were 3,700 instances of euthanasia. 2,700 were by request or assisted suicide, but 1,000 instances of life-ending action were without consent. In a survey of doctors, 27% admitted to performing euthanasia without request. 72% admitted to falsifying death on death certificates, saying death by natural causes. In October 2012, new guidelines were brought in by the Royal Dutch Medical Association, interpreting the criteria which have been given, acceptable criteria for euthanasia in the Euthanasia Act. These now include mental and psychosocial ailments, such as loss of function, loneliness, and loss of autonomy. Unbearable and lasting suffering is now interpreted to include lack of social skills, financial resources, and a social network. So basically, if you're awkward, poor and friendless, then you're a great candidate for euthanasia. This quote from the head of the Dutch Doctors' Union puts it bluntly. We've always predicted that once you start looking at killing as a means to solve problems, then you'll find more and more problems where killing can be the solution. Shivery stuff. Could anyone wish this situation on Australia? I'm starting to wonder whether we need to try and move towards an understanding of death as a part of life. We're so terribly good at avoiding it, and I know I am. Perhaps turning 40's made a difference for me, but I find that I'm more willing to face and to think about it than I have been. Yeah, some of you will have more experience in that than me. Ronald Rolheiser is a Catholic theologian who specialises in spiritual formation. And he puts forward an interesting, a scheme of stages of life. He says there are 3 stages of spiritual maturity. The first he calls essential discipleship. And this is where people are moving from being a child, being an adolescent without responsibilities, to becoming an adult with responsibilities. This is not tied into a particular age, but just as people reach it. He calls this essential discipleship, and he says this part of our lives is about the struggle to get our lives together. The next stage he calls mature discipleship. This is a stage where we are responsible adults, and we've got to the point where we realise that life is actually largely about responsibility. And the challenge for us here, the struggle, is to give our lives away. Having got it together, we give it away. But then, says Rolheiser, comes the third stage, and he calls it radical discipleship. And radical discipleship is what comes when we struggle to give our deaths away. What do you think of that as a concept? He says this: like Jesus, we too are meant to give our lives away in generosity and selflessness, but we are also meant to give our deaths away. Not just at the moment of our deaths, but in the whole process leaving this planet in such a way that our diminishment and death is our final and perhaps greatest gift to the world. So for Rolheiser, death is not only part of life, it's almost the pinnacle. What a challenge. And how completely and utterly inverted an understanding to what our culture has. Do we dare to live and die like this? One final thing. I've reached a few conclusions. That euthanasia, as defined earlier, is morally wrong for Christians. That the arguments supporting euthanasia are based on flawed worldviews and false understandings. And that the practice of euthanasia is too dangerous to allow anyone. But if I'm going to make those conclusions, I must also be willing to face the consequences. Remember, I don't want to tip over on that truth side of the path. I must be prepared to say, although it terrifies me, that I would be willing to walk this path if I'm required to. And I pray that I can do so. Courage and faith. I must also face what these conclusions mean to those people who wish desperately to be able to die at their own request and will be denied this. How can I possibly respond to them? Knowing that they probably will not accept what I say, I would still have to say these 4 things. I do not, and I cannot agree with you that your life is meaningless and worthless. Our society says that only independent, useful, and comfortable people have lives worth living. This is repugnant and untrue. Pain and suffering are perhaps the most difficult thing that we will have to face in our lives, but they are not shameful, nor do they have to rob you of dignity. This is another lie of our culture. You can hold on to dignity by how you choose to face your death. Don't be afraid of being a burden to your loved ones and to society. Why shouldn't you be? You've given so much to them over your life. And looking after those we love, well, that's part of the significance of family. It's a statement of unconditional love. Give them the gift of caring for you. The idea that someone who is sick or old shouldn't impinge on anyone else is completely wrong and degrading to humanity. And finally, you are not alone. I dearly hope that this is true in terms of having caring people around you to give you the empathy and support that you need. But even if this is not true, you're still not alone. The God who has willingly suffered for every one of us has also promised that he will never leave and never forsake us. Thank you for walking this narrow path with me. I look forward to hearing your response and maybe your own experience.
Interesting talk. Now the hard bit comes, where people ask questions or make comments on it. But before anybody else gets to ask a question, I'll dive in first. You actually said that the number one peg that the preservation of life depends on is the sovereignty of God. Well, wouldn't that depend on how you interpret the sovereignty of God? If the sovereignty of God means that everything happens in accordance with God's will, wouldn't that also encompass euthanasia? So what do you actually mean by the sovereignty of God?
Yes. I'm pretty much in the most fundamental of terms, sort of saying that I think there's I go back to that sort of difference between passive and active euthanasia, that if things happen and someone can be kept alive, but we choose to take that away, and yet there's a point at which...
So it's following the natural course of events.
I guess so, you could call it that. But there's a point at which we are all appointed to die, and unless we choose to do that sooner, then God is the one who has the control over that.
But by actually using the sovereignty of God, isn't that the same as arguing, we should just kind of hang around and do nothing because God does what he wills?
Yeah, don't even do medical treatment in the first place.
Yeah.
I wouldn't subscribe to that.
That's in the sovereignty of God too, Kevin.
Yeah, well, that,
God decides you don't sit there and do nothing.
it just seemed to me funny to appeal to the sovereignty of God as a reason for not taking action in terms of a person's death, because you could, if you apply that across the board to all other human activities, then you do nothing.
But then you could extend that out to say, well, why don't we kill the people that aren't very pleasant? Because
Who's right?
or even sort of more than that aren't productive or are unacceptable to the community. Maybe that's God's will as well. I mean, I think you've got to see, or I see sort of the sovereignty of God as being there for the good of his people. And I mean, surely none of us believe that everything on this earth is a direct result of God's will, because he said that he's given us free will, and sometimes there are consequences to that, surely.
Oh yeah, I was just questioning the use of the sovereignty of God to actually be a determining factor.
Maybe it's like it's not his actual will being done. It's the right that he has as God to have his will being done.
It's a person's submission to God's timing. Not that you don't do anything for the rest of your life or that you don't take other actions, but that you submit that to his will rather than trying to take it into your own hands.
All right, I'll leave it. Other people?
I'm just not sure how submitting to his timing as such, like that. If that is the case, then should we be allowed to take medical treatment, for instance, if that's not really submitting to his timing? Because if we're just entirely submitting to God's timing, then we would assume that he'll take us when he wants to take us, and then we shouldn't have a triple bypass for our heart, for instance, if we have a heart attack or something like that.
Yeah. I guess the thing is that we can accept things that will prolong our lives, but there comes a point where we can't do that anymore. And so in a sense where there is a limit, there's always that limit. Whereas the other way, there is no limit, we can jump off the cliff.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I think the Bible teaches that death and disease are an intruder, basically, into God's creation, and therefore we have to fight against it.
Yeah. God is the healer, and he calls us to ask for that.
Yeah, but that's why I believe that if death and disease, according to the Christian belief, is an intruder, is not not what God really wants. He doesn't want that, but the fall man caused that problem to happen. Then we have, it's up to us to do everything we can to stop that, to try to minimise disease, suffering, and all of that sort of stuff. Otherwise, we just hang around and do nothing. And people in Africa or overseas, we just let them suffer. Well, there's no point to that. That's not the Christian viewpoint at all. The Christian viewpoint is you do everything you can to help other people.
I think Miranda's point originally was that you do everything you can to help them to live.
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
In every way you can.
Frame it like that, yeah.
That's right.
I think because God has given the gift to all the doctors that have this research and advance on medication. So for those, sometimes they take medication, they can be healed. Some are not, because the Bible says God have compassion for those who have compassion, have mercy to those who have mercy. Yeah. So it's not for us to compare with why this person can heal and this cannot heal. That is a sovereignty.
And I think as we accept medical help, as we take medical help, we are still doing that in submission of saying, this may save me or this may not.
Yeah.
You presented 2 stools tonight, one of which wouldn't support weight, and the other one that seemed to be only applicable to Christians. So for those who are not Christians, where do they sit?
On the ground.
Yes, I'm aware of that sort of I think for non-Christians, the only thing is the thing that I don't think we can be trusted. Now, that is a theologically held belief of mine, but I think there's also a fair bit of evidence out there that it's true. And yes, I would like people to be able to to sit on the sovereignty of God, but if they choose not to believe that, then there's still this issue of human beings are not to be trusted.
Yeah, because you started off.
Death over another human being.
With power of life.
Because you started off your argument with biblical arguments,
Yes.
which is not something you can take into the public square, really, is it?
Okay.
I think you did a pretty good job of it, actually.
But if you're arguing in the public square, shouldn't you be using a shared authority? So,
Not if you're a Christian.
This is a methodological question that you have.
Yeah.
And, you know, generally I accept what you're saying, and that's what John Dixon says, and I agree with him. But I have to say, listening to the way Miranda did it, and I can put myself in the shoes of a non-believer and go and not be offended listening to that. What do you think, Phil? Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
I think that you
It explained the position, but would it change somebody's mind that's not a non-Christian to support euthanasia or not?
Would it?
I'm asking that question. Would it?
most non-Christians, I know a number of non-Christians are pretty hard-nosed and would be water off a duck's back, really.
Yeah.
I guess I would not be expecting a non-Christian to accept the argument at the point of biblical witness. That's
No, of course not.
for those who have that belief.
There's one other point that you made in the Netherlands. Was it the Netherlands? Where they've had this legislation for a while. And there was a thing on the ABC just recently about this particular problem that they have, and a person who chose that he didn't want to live anymore, and he had, was it dementia?
Onset of dementia.
Just the onset of dementia, and decided he didn't want to go down that track, and he was quite
Lucid.
yeah, and he just didn't want to do that himself, so that it's scary that it's come to that over there, and if we legislate for that here, are we going to go down the same track? And possibly we would.
In that particular case, the doctor didn't administer anything, he gave him the cup. And the person actually drank it, fell asleep and died. And so...
He's still providing the cup.
He's still providing the ingredients in the cup.
I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the doctor was interviewed and he's done it 50 times. And he considered it a beautiful thing.
In the Netherlands.
Yeah.
But you speak to other doctors who won't do it.
The beauty of such things at the moment. There's an ad on SBS. That's right. Doesn't matter. It's slightly tangent.
I think what they found in the Netherlands is that as things went on, the spectrum of things for which it was considered suitable got wider and wider.
Yeah.
So that in the end it became almost a social thing, like saying, I'm just tired of living, I just want to go.
Yeah.
Now, I have personal experience of knowing relatives who have said, I'm just ready to die, I just want to go. But you wouldn't do anything, and she wouldn't have done anything, but that's how she felt.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between feeling like that and saying, okay, well, give me the stuff on off. And it seems that whenever this has become established in the community, it's like abortion. I think that's a very good analogy, where it just gets wider and wider and wider. And in the end, it's anyone who doesn't want to go ahead with pregnancy or whatever, or doesn't want to go ahead with their dementia or something else, they just say, well, I'm out of here now, I want to go now. And once you start deciding when you're going to go, it's very, I mean, most doctors, I don't know a doctor that actually approves of euthanasia, that supports euthanasia. I just don't know any doctor that does.
They're probably there.
They may do, but I don't know.
He's a doctor in the skin.
I do know Dr. Wolski, yeah, but I don't know him personally. I don't
Trust him.
Trust him, no.
My own mother had Parkinson's disease and a sudden onset of dementia, and so she degenerated really quickly, but she had enough sense to know what was happening. And I just remember visiting her with the kids, and she just blurted out, "I just want to die." And it took 7 years for it to happen. And so you kind of scratch your head and think, well, what was right in that situation? But I had no intention of triggering anything. And,
yes, but I mean, on the other hand, I know a number of elderly people that were perfectly lucid, but they were just sick of living. They were tired. They got, they couldn't exercise. They just sort of sat at home, and their life just progressively shrunk. And they just said, well, I think, the quicker I go, the better. But I mean, that's I guess what we've all got to be, and each person sort of meets their own death in their own way. But I think once you start letting someone else make the choice for them, then the whole thing gets out of control.
I think there's something in it too about how we in our culture view older people. If we had a 20-year-old saying, "I just don't want to live anymore," would we go, "Oh, he's a cunt"? No, of course we wouldn't. We would rush them off to counselling, or we would support them and we'd do everything we could. We'd treat them for mental illness or whatever it was. But we seem to have a different attitude to someone who's further toward the end of
Over
it.
40.
I don't think that's right.
Why not? Because the person's lived their life. That's the culture. The thing there is simply that person's got their life in front of them.
Yeah, but the fact that you've lived your life doesn't mean that you're worthless.
Oh, no. Look, there was a politician in WA that made himself infamous by saying that, wasn't it? What did he say? They withhold benefits to people over 70 or something like that. We weren't going to help them anymore. Yeah, treatment over 70. Okay. Yeah, he was serious. A Liberal guy or something, wasn't he?
You're joking?
Yeah, no. It was put forward as possible.
Some people are as healthy as anything.
Yeah, no, well, but that was a way of, that was a rationalist approach economic rationalist approach to keeping the health system problems.
There's a sector of the community that needs most medical help. What was he?
But no, I'm just reporting on the fact that there are people that can actually say that. That we're not worth it, we're a drain on society.
We're all a drain on society.
Well, we're pretty close to that.
that's the argument, don't you understand, Perry? We'd save, look at all the money we'd save if you...
Bumped us all off.
Yeah, bump off the
What a place it would be.
Run by animals.
Like you, Miranda,
iRobot.
I haven't experienced this sort of thing, so I'm a little bit hesitant, like you are, to go too much. But one of the things that I've thought over the years, based on things that I've read, is that it's not pain and suffering that does people in. It's not loss of dignity that does people in. People have pushed through all of those things. It's loss of hope.
Sorry, loss of hope.
Yeah.
It's a mental thing.
Yes, that's what I mean. At the end, you realise, well, what is there anymore?
Yeah.
Which applies, as you were saying, to 20-year-olds as much as 90-year-olds.
My mum asked to die when she was dying, and and she, she asked me to help her die.
That's an incredible burden to ask somebody, isn't it?
Yeah, but she was dying already.
Yes, I know that. But
and she was very concerned. She had decided to not get further treatment and, life prolonging treatment. And she was very concerned that it was going to be given to her regardless. And she said, "Oh, it's a terrible thing to ask." I said, "Well, yeah, it is too terrible and I can't do that. But no, I am making sure that they don't give you more treatment." And that was the thing where I was able to honour her wishes, because
I'll be there and I'll make sure.
because the doctors had said, well, she'd had lung cancer, and then she went into remission, and then came back with brain cancer, and the surgeon had said, well, we can remove it, we can do chemo, let's go for another round of 2 years of all this sort of thing. And she'd said no, right? And I mean, it would have been perfectly reasonable for her to say yes, and that would have been good from my side of things. But both my sister and I respected. She said no, she doesn't. She's done it once. She doesn't want to do it again. And but so then I was because she went through a stage, then she was trying to take the least amount of medicine, for a couple of days, and she was trying to, and so she was pushing out the amount of time until she had the next hit of morphine or whatever, and so I was deciding there's no point in doing that, you're not going to make yourself die faster, you're just going to make yourself die in more pain, and so then she accepted that, but
So that would be a situation that most of us wouldn't find ourselves in, I would have thought.
the nurse did a beautiful, there was one nurse in particular who did a beautiful job of more or less explaining your theology in very simple terms. I don't know what her religious background is or anything, but because Mum was saying to her, I want to die, help me die, and I'm sitting in the chair next to her, but the nurse is with her, and the nurse was reassuring her and saying, when it's your time, dear, you will go. So
I think palliative care is very important.
She was a very good palliative nurse.
And in fact, in areas where there is strong support for palliative care, the talk about wanting to bring in euthanasia and so on is much less, because people see that there is they can be made comfortable. In the vast majority of cases, you can make people comfortable in their last days, and if you've got that alternative, people don't fear it, and it's not the dying, it's the fear of pain and the fear of the unknown.
I'm totally there as well. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of dying painfully.
Oh
Yeah.
Most people are.
I think the process, you see, people is not scared of dying, and like you said, it's a process of death is difficult.
Yeah.
But you look at our Maker, our Lord Jesus, He has died through every single suffering.
Yeah.
So who are we? We still have to go through suffering.
Yeah, but suffering's really bad.
But if you can help us through that, then so much the better.
Yeah.
I think we'll all agree with that.
Woody Allen once said, I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Like my father-in-law was just like your mom. When he had a heart enlarged in the hospital, he wanted to die. He asked his children to buy the razor blade for him to commit suicide. I said, no, you can't do it because you are Christian, you commit suicide. That is against God's will in taking your life. I said, you want to go back to Jesus, you pray and He will take you home. You just make sure that you let go everything and willing to follow Him. So he prayed and prayed. He passed away 3 days after, died in the sleep.
The Apostle Paul wanted to die, didn't he? He wanted Christ to take him.
But then he decided it was better for everyone else that he stayed.
He stayed. Yeah.
Quite the avatar.
So we got the letter to
But for others of us, it may be the reverse.
Yeah.
With
I
the
think.
Sorry, with the statistics that you mentioned, could you just quickly run through them again? Got a question about the stats. These are Dutch stats. Yeah.
The Netherlands one.
Yeah.
Of 2,700 instances of euthanasia on request, but 1,000 instances of euthanasia without consent.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So what happened in that case? The euthanasia we have is without request. What happened there? Were people not able to make a decision? Or?
No, it was doctors taking it into their own hands.
Oh, okay.
It's the coup de grace in a hospital where a doctor's seen it all before and makes the decision.
Yeah.
If
So
someone's brain dead or something.
Yeah, so the person can't make the decision.
Yeah.
but this was instances of no consent given by a family.
Any
members either.
family.
So wouldn't there be
Doctors
some
taking it.
legal implications?
And this was
The doctor enforced the death
Not-
certificate.
no.
was this before the
The doctor
legislation
enforced the death
too?
certificate.
I think you said.
Yes,
Yeah.
this was
So
1990.
this was just doctors admitting to what's probably happening in our hospitals too.
Yes, although they had these a few sort of landmark court cases
but,
which had set out conditions. and
Talking to
criteria.
some doctors, it does happen.
I think they
Quite a
did
bit.
that to my dad.
Yeah.
I think they did, because my dad, he was an amputee for a long time. He was told he'd have 2 years to live. He lived 12 years from that point. So he was told he had 2 years to live when I was 12. He died when I was 24, because they had, developments in ways to keep people alive in the interim. And and he was an absolute mess, and he was in hospital, but he didn't want to die, and he thought that they were trying to kill him, and I didn't know what to do about that, because I was, this is starting from when I'm about 19, and he had dementia anyway, so I just thought, oh, my dad's paranoid, and but then the week that he died, all these geriatricians had come in to see him, and all of this sort of stuff, and he told me some of his crazy thoughts, but I actually think that he wasn't wrong deep down. I actually think all these geriatricians did come in and go, no, it's over, and they did actually just allow him to, not euthanasia in the active sense you're talking about, but passive euthanasia without his consent. Yeah.
My wife's dad was 85 and he went into hospital. They pretty much wrote him off. But the week before he'd been working on the farm. So we came to go and say, well, look, he's quite able-bodied. This is not normal. And within another 5 years, quite well. So the doctors will write people off for over a certain age, I guess. Not over.
There's some interesting examples in the Bible, like the death of Saul. Would you like to comment on that?
So the death of Saul, he asked for his armour bearer to kill him, and his armour bearer refused. So he did it himself.
Oh, Saul or something.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot of people falling on their swords back then. Not very clumsy more.
Or like laying him on the ground and chopping him off.
But Saul is dead. Saul is not. There's nothing in the text that condemns Saul for his action.
No.
I think it's presented fairly matter-of-factly and without any particular judgment.
And the interesting thing is
He was injured, and he knew that the enemy were coming through, and he didn't want to be caught still alive.
I think in those circumstances I'd rather die too, because there's that fear. My fear of being tortured or having a lot of pain is much higher than my fear of death.
Then you had the contrary account where the Amalekite reported to David that he had actually killed Saul because Saul requested it. And then David
brought down judgment on him.
Yeah. It's kind of puzzled me a bit.
I mean, a vast amount of the Old Testament is really just placed before us, isn't it? There is very little judgment often on what's happening. It's told as a story. And I think we know that David didn't always make the wrong decision. And whether that was a right one or not is actually not specified either.
But even in the book of Job, that God spoke to Satan that you can do whatever you want to him, but spare his life. So that's why we cannot take anyone's life. Very clearly.
It was the devil, wasn't it? Wasn't allowed to do that.
Yeah.
He did take his children's lives.
His wives and families.
I know.
It would seem to me, though, that any sort of legislation to bring in a right to euthanasia is always going to expose and put at risk the vulnerable.
That's the argument that Miranda
which
made
is, yes,
very well.
yeah. And there's just, you've got no way of protecting the vulnerable.
To be blunt, I don't think you need to be a Christian to.
No, absolutely.
And they can't protect themselves, that's the other thing.
There is no way of legislating and protecting the vulnerable if you bring in the right for someone to die. And that, to me, that's the big one.
And that's particularly like my experience as an estate solicitor, just seeing how people are treated in their last days is not good by their own families, and fully justified. And you see the worst sides of humanity when it comes out.
And with all the proposed legislation they've brought in, or they've tried to bring in so far, they've always had it too broad.
Yes.
They've tried to incorporate such a broad spectrum of who would be allowed to be.
Yeah.
Let alone looking at the narrowness that there's no way you can protect the vulnerable.
That's right. Luckily, when it's as broad as that, it's generally unconstitutional.
But surely they'll get wise and will narrow it.
Yeah, well, that should be their tactic, isn't it? They should go for it very narrow, and once it's legislated, then broaden it. I think I'll become an advisor.
It's okay, this is going on YouTube, don't get the picture.
Oh.
I guess we've already had euthanasia in many parts of the world before the Second World War, in Germany, even in America, England. It was done. Yeah, that's right. So it was done, pretty swept under the carpet, pretty horrible. But, so people want another crack at it.
Yeah, and it'll come around probably.
Yeah.
Eventually. Sadly.
Not without a fight. Not without a fight.
Can I put you on the spot, Rachel? You're a young medical student. Have you got any thoughts on this issue?
Not from personal experience, probably because I'm too young.
Get rid of everybody over 20.
I am. Because partly because I don't have much clinical experience. I guess my thoughts on the whole thing, like, I was thinking when you said that your stool stands on the sovereignty of God, I think you'd have to look at God as a whole. So God's sovereign, but He's also righteous, and He's also good, and He's also for life. So to put the stool, the chair, the plank, only on one pillar is to limit who God is, or would you say it is, or would you say that's just, I guess?
Oh, you're welcome to as many legs as you like. I just think that's all we need.
Okay, so it's more like
it just I think that's enough, but not exclusively, or that we shouldn't bring in.
All right. Is anybody else got any question or comment they'd like to make?
It's a different issue, but it is related though.
Yeah.
As we can do more and more and more for a cost, inevitably we're going to run up against questions of who gets what.
We already do.
Well, of course we already do on a global scale. People die because there isn't the money for a $300 procedure all the time. But even within our first world context, it's going to become more of an issue as more things can be done, and so there is another discussion that does need to be had there, And I mean, I could start with personal experience, where if I am right in thinking the doctors decided to go against my dad's will, as he thought they were, and withhold certain things that could have saved his life for another month again, if I'm right in thinking that, were the doctors wrong for doing it? You know? And those are sort of questions that need to be asked as well.
But as the population ages, these things are going to get more and more important.
Yeah.
And pressing.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, in my own experience, we would not recommend that someone had a bypass if they were more than 70 years old. And they just said, oh no, you're too old. And it's a waste of money.
Are you a doctor? Okay,
And I was doing the angiograms and telling them.
So were you around when my dad...
What hospital was he in?
He was in almost every hospital in Adelaide.
It doesn't ring a bell.
Okay.
But no, I was going to say. So we would. I would present a case of with an angiogram and show that they had blocks in 3 arteries, and this fellow was sort of 71 or 72 or something, and they'd say, we'll just treat him symptomatically, but we won't go to the expense of giving him bypass.